When I began looking for a place to live, a tight-knit community with good neighbors was the highest priority on my list. It may sound strange, but the idea of being surrounded by good, average folks as I planted my roots had always been attractive to me. I was lucky enough to have a good-paying job lined up for right after high school. My uncle owned a chain of candy stores in a town called Foxwood. He employed me under the table since the moment I turned 12 years old. Now, in my early 20s, I was the second in command. As I grew ready to leave my parents' house, it was a no-brainer to begin my search in Foxwood. After all, I had already built up a bit of a career for myself, and I had no intention of leaving. Don't get me wrong, I recognize the privilege in the cards that I was dealt. Most people my age are off at university, studying with the hopes of landing a job as lucrative as the one I've had since I began puberty. My pay isn't totally without merit, however. I'm a natural when it comes to sales, and I single-handedly grew my uncle's business tenfold, even as a kid. I really hate to admit it, but my good fortune continued when I began my search for a home. Setting out into Foxwood, I quickly stumbled upon the neighborhood of my dreams. As I drove through the residential side of town, a bevy of signs caught my attention. They led me to a dead-end street, with large evergreen trees standing guard at either side of the entrance. As I turned onto the road, the response to my presence couldn't have been more surprising. There were more children than I could count. They were riding bikes, playing ball, and running around using their imaginations. Several adults walked up and down the street, their watchful eyes protecting the children that squealed and giggled as they played. Every last soul, both young and old, smiled and waved at my vehicle as I drove by. Each house that I passed was beautiful. The lawns were all perfectly maintained, and not so much as a paint chip was out of place. It was far from boring or cookie cutter. All of the homes were quite unique and personalized. But it was clear that the residents gave the proper respect to their living conditions. It wasn't until I reached the end of the street that I found what I was looking for. A large blue house emerged from the trees that shaded it from the front yard. Rows of greenery separated the structure from the other houses on either side of it. A single sign sat perched in front of the home, advertising that it was, in fact, available. I'll spare you the details. A number of phone calls later, I had set up an official tour of the house. After making an offer and completing a whole lot of paperwork, I had myself a mortgage and was moving into my new home immediately. I was officially a homeowner. The first few weeks in the neighborhood were great. I had expected my neighbors to question someone so young moving into their domain, and all alone at that. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. They treated me like family. On the first day alone, I was given enough dinners to last me a week. Not a single household declined to come introduce themselves to me, and I immediately felt right at home. It only took a month before my pleasant experience began turning into a hellish one. It all began when I spotted a moving truck parked in my next-door neighbor's driveway. Frankly, I was a bit surprised that the vehicle was there. There were no signs advertising that the property was being sold, and the Scott family hadn't mentioned anything about leaving. Making my way out of the house and over towards the truck, I realized that a large team of movers were taking items from inside. There must have been 20 guys there, if not more. I even counted 17 of them, but faces I didn't recognize continued to emerge after I gave up finding the total size of the crew. Deciding to approach one of the men, I got a story that I never expected to hear. Apparently, the Scots had not yet put the house on the market at all. The man told me that the family had paid top dollar to get their stuff out of there fast. He went on to tell me that the family reported strange noises inside of their house. Things began to move around to places they hadn't been before, seemingly on their own. Possibly strangest of all, food began disappearing from the kitchen. It was only specific things, though. Fruits, vegetables, cheese, that sort of thing. As far as the moving crew was told, the family was freaked out enough to up and leave altogether. My first inclination was to think that the man was lying. But the Scots had hired a lot of movers, so he couldn't be entirely wrong. Still, how did I not know about this? I was supposed to believe that my neighbors had experienced something that made them leave so quickly, caused them to abandon their home. As I pondered what the man had told me, I thanked him before turning around and returning to my own house. Throughout the day, I peeked out my window and down at the activity next door. The crew moved in pairs as they removed furniture from the home. All except for one of them, that is. He seemed to distance himself from the others, and, at times, even hide. A supervisor, maybe? I let the blinds fall just in front of my nose. I shook my head and cursed myself for being so nosy. One man tells an eerie story, and I get my panties in a twist. Retreating from the window, I elected to call it a night before making some dinner and heading to bed. The next morning, the Scots house was calm and still. Empty as well, I presumed. Shuddering at the thought, I attempted to shove it in the back of my mind. As I poured myself a bowl of cereal, a series of creaking noises erupted from the attic above me. My neck snapped towards the ceiling, and I listened for anything else out of the ordinary. After several silent moments had gone by, I continued to eat my breakfast. One ear perked up in case anything else happened. But it never did. Reassuring myself that the noises had been the house settling, I placed my bowl in the sink before leaving for work. I would have saved myself a lot of trouble if I had never returned at all. It was a typical day at work. Like I mentioned before, my uncle's candy recipes were absolutely beloved by the nearby residents. Our shops have been a staple in the community for years now. We had so many customers come in, the day was over before I knew it, and I was heading home feeling as though it had only just begun. With that being said, the traffic on my way home was terrible. It was a slow crawl through gridlocked vehicles, and a wave of relief washed over me when I finally turned into my neighborhood. That feeling, however, was short-lived. Despite the weather being absolutely perfect, and not a single cloud being present in the sky, nobody was outside. I was shocked at the lack of people, but I brushed off the concern and focused on the final stretch of my journey home. As I neared the end of the block, yet another strange thing caught my eye. Jogging in place in the Scots house front yard was former Navy SEAL and athlete David Goggins. Reaching my driveway and throwing the car into park, I moved quickly to meet the man. Nearing the figure, I introduced myself before inquiring about whether or not he had moved into the house behind him. Without stopping his workout routine, Goggins gave me a slight head nod. He refused to glance in my direction as I expressed my surprise at his presence in such a humble town. A silence fell over the two of us, and I waited several moments before making another attempt at conversation. When I began expressing how nice it was to meet him, Goggins pushed past me before starting a steady jog down the block and out of sight. I stood frozen in place for several minutes after the figure had disappeared. amazed at what I had just witnessed. Eventually, though, the shock dissipated, and there was nothing left to do but go back home. Later that evening, the thought of making something for dinner weighed heavily on me. For a day that had begun so normally, it sure had been turned upside down. Deciding to take the easy way out, I pulled out my phone before pressing the DoorDash app and beginning to scroll. I had no desire to search for anything fancy, and Taco Bell quickly caught my eye. Feeling no further need for human contact, I selected the leave at door option and confirmed my desire for a few Chalupa Supremes. When my driver arrived, he rang my doorbell violently. The sound assaulted my eardrums as volleys of 5 rings came at a time. A single silent moment separated each volley, followed by 5 more rings of the bell, and so on and so forth. Expecting the driver to give up eventually, I refused to answer the door. When the ringing continued, I shouted out towards the door, telling the person on the other side to leave the food on my porch. Despite this, the doorbell continued to ring. I strode to the door, my patience now hanging on by a thread. When I threw the barrier open, my frustration faded away, quickly being replaced by confusion. Standing on the other side of the doorway was Goggins. I stood under the frame, speechless as I stared into the eyes of my visitor. The man standing across from me brought his gaze down, eyeballing the Taco Bell bag that now sat on my front porch. After peering at my dinner for several seconds, Goggins brought his head back up, his eyes now level with mine. Just as I began to stutter out a response, to ask my new neighbor what he wanted, he brought his right foot up in a swift motion, connecting it with my jaw and sending me sprawling backwards. My head came down directly on my hardwood floor, and it hit hard. The unexpected attack had left me no chance to defend myself, and my vision danced between clarity and blurriness. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was the form of Goggins disappearing into the dark, my bag of Taco Bell in his hand. I remained unconscious on the floor for the entire night. When I awoke, my front door remained wide open, and the sun had been up for several hours. As I checked my phone, the time read 11:49 a.m., and the screen reported that I had 17 missed calls. My uncle was not happy when I called out sick for the rest of the day, but my perfect attendance record prior to this was enough to make him relent. With that cleared up, my next point of order was Goggins. I stormed over to the house beside mine, pounding on the door upon arriving. The last thing I expected was to leave even more confused than when I arrived. As my fist pounded into the front door, it swung open. It didn't take a rocket scientist to question the scene in front of me. The house was completely and utterly empty. Throwing a glance over my shoulder, I confirmed that nobody was out and about. The only thing that I could think to do was go inside. Not a single room in the house had anything in it. This threw me off. Could it be that Goggins simply hadn't moved any of his stuff yet? If so, why the hell was he at my front door last night at all? And that's ignoring the fact that he put me to sleep with a kick to the face. Anger began to creep back into my psyche as I retreated from the house. I had just been assaulted by David Goggins the night before, and now I was questioning whether or not he was squatting in my neighbor's house. My suspicion only deepened as I emerged onto the sidewalk, spotting a figure entering my front door as I did so. Sprinting back home, I burst into the building, shouting and cursing at the intruder. When I made my way into the kitchen, the scene before me left my body frozen in place. Every cabinet and drawer was open and emptied out. The doors to the refrigerator and the freezer were torn off completely, the contents as bare as the rest of the kitchen. I had no food, dishes, or silverware left at all. Granted, my stock levels weren't very high yet, but it was enough to get by. Spray painted on my kitchen floor were the words, "Stay hard." My world faded in and out around me as questions raced through my brain. Just as I began fearing that another blackout was imminent, a scurry of footsteps snapped my attention back into focus. I charged towards the sound, just catching a glimpse of a figure exiting out through my front door. Rather than try to catch the figure, I moved to the main window in my living room. Already halfway down the block, Goggins sprinted in the opposite direction of my home. He pulled a large cart behind him, containing all my stuff that was missing from my house. After clearing the remainder of my house and locking every entrance point, I stumbled into my room. My blood was boiling as I removed my phone from my pocket before typing a 9 and then a 1. With my finger hovering over the final digit, it became obvious that the story needed polishing before being relayed to a dispatcher. Hours went by as I paced back and forth at the foot of my bed. No matter how many times I recounted the story to myself, it never sounded realistic enough to pursue. Could I say that my home had been robbed and leave it at that? Technically, yes, but it would do very little to solve the issue at hand. Nothing less than a full-fledged accusation towards David Goggins was going to do the trick. Still searching for the courage to call the police, my stomach dropped as the tweets of the morning birds made their way into my house. Being late again was simply not an option. Goggins would have to wait as I got ready for work. Pulling my uniform on, I left the house before hopping into my car and heading towards the candy shop. As I neared the building, the scene that unfolded in front of me was enough to make my stomach turn. 3 fire trucks were parked next to each other in the front lot. Large hoses sprayed down the ashes of what had once been my uncle's candy shop, and rows of tape sealed off the perimeter of the disaster. Uniformed police officers stood guard around the barrier, and a medical crew of some kind was poking around through the ashes. The events of the past couple of days all caught up to me at once. What little sanity I had left flew out the window, and I had no intention of following the proper channels to gather information. Caution tape fluttered to the ground as I tore into the perimeter. Several shouts rang out behind me as I made my way into the pile of rubble. Ash coated my shoes, and my clothing dampened from the moisture hanging in the air. As I approached the EMTs in the middle of the scene, it became clear that they stood over a crumpled figure. You must keep in mind that I wasn't thinking very clearly. I barreled into the first responders in front of me. As the men hit the ground, they began to roll around in the ash. This provided me a moment to examine the thing on the ground. The charred remains in front of me were my uncle. Tears welled in my eyes as I knelt over the corpse. Placing my hands into his, I felt something. A small index card had been placed in my uncle's hand. Pulling it out, I saw that the card read, "DG sends his regards." Did this stand for David Goggins? Glancing over my shoulder, I saw several police officers charging in my direction. Turning the index card over, I noticed another thing. Taped on the back of the card was a single chocolate truffle. Without another moment to spare, I put the card in my pocket before running towards my vehicle. Apparently, I caught my first break in quite some time. None of the officers had elected to cut off the path to my car, and even with my large stature, I easily outran all of them. Peeling out of the lot, and with nowhere left to go, I headed for home. Despite what I had experienced and the death of my uncle, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. It was anybody's guess what the next few days would have in store for me. I imagined I'd be getting a visit from the police, and my inability to report my stolen food was coming back to haunt me. Now they were going to point to me as the main suspect in my uncle's death. I just knew they were. As I got closer to my neighborhood, only one thing was a certainty in my mind. Goggins needed to pay for what he had done. My plan was a simple one. Goggins had been easy to draw out before, albeit incidentally. He was a god in the world of fitness, and something had caused him to go scorched earth against all things unhealthy. I had no idea why he had chosen me, but he had knocked me out for ordering Taco Bell, stolen all my food, and burnt my uncle's candy shop down to the ground. My foe was a creature of habit, and his intense nature had formed him into the man he was today. My plan was to bring that world down around him. I was going to make him interrupt his routine. My plan was set into motion as the sun disappeared from the horizon. Sitting in my living room, I pulled out my phone from my pocket. Clenching my jaw, I selected the DoorDash app once again. Ordering a few Chalupa Supremes, I waited for the knocks on the door to begin just as they had the other night. It didn't take long for me to get my wish. My lips curled into a sly smile, and I sprung up and headed towards the door. Turning the knob, I knew what to expect this time around. Sure enough, Goggins was waiting for me on the other side. His roundhouse kick was flying towards my face as soon as I opened the door. As I avoided the kick, I realized that my plan was now a full go. My main goal was to remain conscious as Goggins made me his personal punching bag. He made his way through the doorway, clenching my shirt in both fists as he tossed me onto the living room floor. His figure pounced on me, launching a volley of punches into my face in midsection. I tried in vain to block the blows from connecting. The blows continued, and one shot directly to my nose left me feeling like it had been broken. The man on top of me bared his teeth, breathing heavily, yet refusing to speak a single word. Goggins paused his attack, looking me up and down as he admired his work. My body laid out in front of him, bruised and bloodied. A stern look came over his face, and he clasped both hands around my neck. He squeezed his hands, leaving me coughing and sputtering for breath. Stars danced across my vision, and I fought to remain awake. I had him right where I wanted him. Reaching into my pocket, I removed the chocolate truffle that had been on my uncle's corpse. Flinging my arm up, I popped the sweet treat into Goggins' mouth. Letting go of my neck, the intruder stumbled backwards and off of me, choking as he fell. He screamed as it became clear what had happened. He had eaten a piece of candy. I watched as the stoic man became a blubbering mess on my living room floor. He burst into tears. Not only had the threat been neutralized, but the man now appeared to be at my mercy. Before you judge what I did next, try putting yourself in my shoes. As the grown man lay crying on my floor, I couldn't bring myself to get rid of him. Electing to spare him, he was left forever in my debt. I've got him tied up in my basement now. A glass of sugar-infused water at the top of every hour has kept him in his pathetic state. I can hear him crying as I record this now. Honestly, I don't really know where to go from here. I still expect the police to be on my case about the fire, but I can't really do anything about it now. Special precautions will need to be taken to ensure they don't find my new pet. All I really know is you'll be hearing a lot less from David Goggins.